Good afternoon. We are going to start because time is limited. My name is Luis Naranjo, and it is a great honor for me to introduce Preston's conference. I'm sure that we will all be very happy to sacrifice the siesta time and enjoy Paul Preston's presentation. I'm not really going to introduce Preston, we all know him very well. And I just like to express my very deep thanks for the generosity of this extraordinary, eminent historian of civil war, the coup d'etat, the dictatorship and everything of the whole period. So on behalf of the Socio-Cultural Association of La Desbandada, and also on behalf of you all, I think we can all be very thankful for his conference and his work. What can we say about his work? He's become a reference and also heritage. He's a piece of heritage, in fact. As retired history professor, I can acknowledge him as a reference for those who, like me, are criticize or have a point of view, a critical point of view on what the coup d'etat, the war, and the dictatorship meant for the Spanish people and also for the Andalusian people. Very few historians have done so much as Preston in order to break the view we inherited from Francoism and the transition period. His work is a declaration and a statement against negationism and he's actually trying to fight those trends. Preston is one of the great Anglo-Saxon historians like Ian Gibson, Hugh Thomas, Stanley Payne, and others, he's at the opposite of Preston, ideologically opposite to Preston and some of these other historians. So we must place him as a key figure, and his work is very well linked to liberal and progressive historiography that started off in the 18th and then continued its development and led to Lead, Eliot, Bartolomé de la Salle, also many Hispanists, also Ferdinand Brovel, also all these linked to the French studies. Well, Preston was born in Liverpool, and he inherited this tradition that has been characterized for many, since really long, by being brilliant in his expositions, but also very truthful and view and strict scientific rigor. So a very well-built narrative narrative line, and also literature expression in terms of literature. And this is contributed with the criticism of the Salar's French history school. And I believe that this link of classic British historiography and the annals, what does this offer? The view of the masses instead of that of the elites, considering the subject of history as class groups instead of individuals, considering history from the point of view of the analysis of problems, and we've seen that in his books. A key problem is why the reason for the violence of Francoism for such a long time, and we need to analyze the historical reasons for that, not just saying that they were really bad. And also the Calvins, that was from an elite, linking that with a proletarian marginalized who was a phalangist from a small village and that was killed. So this blood pact is also at the basis of Francoism's terror. So in his works he refers to all these topics with a level of excellence. Since the end of the 16th, when he visited Spain for the first time, he had a personal link with our country, growing year after year, and at the end of the 70s he published a book, Reaction, Revolution and Revenge, and he showed his interest in analyzing the violence, enormous violence of Francoism from its beginning. And since then his works have been continued in this line with the architects of the terror, with the scientific analysis of the revenge and the class terror, that this is something clear in his works. In these last 50 years, Preston has considered the very complex topic of the war in Spain and dictatorship from many different perspectives, and he's been advanced to his times, as he considered in 2001, for example, the gender topic in the book on women, Doves of War for Women of Spain. He has also published the best biography of the dictatorship, Franco, a biography, and also Santiago Carrillo, Del Zorro Rojo in Spanish. Also, his international perspective, that is a very recent, this is a very recent approach, but that he already studied, which is necessary to understand the beginning and the end and conclusion of the war in Spain, is considered also in another of his books, and also in another book published in 2007 on the reporters. We saw Spain die, foreign correspondents in the Spanish Civil War. Institutional terror was one of the characteristics of Francoism, and he has identified that in his books, like the ones that refer to the architects and also to Guernica. There's a specific work that was really impressive for me. I was really marked by it because it showed the blood links that were linking Caldism and the Phalangists, and that's the politics of revenge. There's another important work, the Spanish Holocaust. From my point of view, this is an absolutely necessary work. And why? Because we needed a synthesis, a general overview that would consider the whole panorama of Francoism's violence in just one book, and that's what Preston achieved to do. And now, to conclude, well, I'm going to do this because I know we've got time limitations, and we are going to learn with the words of the great historian Paul Preston. Good afternoon. I'm really sorry not to be able to be here with you today. I am trapped here in London, and I'm going to talk about the testimonies or witnesses of atrocities. I'm going to talk about the atrocities that took place in Malaga and then on the road from Malaga to Almeria. These atrocities were started before the fall of the city, and they were anticipated by the general. And Gramel Rusi, the wife of General Brennan, the British writer, heard Capo de Llano, the general, say in the radio the following. He said, "Yes, you anarchists in Malaga, wait until I'll be there in 10 days' time. I will sit down at a cafeteria in the street Larios, and every time I drink a sip, 10 of you will die. I will shoot 10 of you for each of ours, even if I need to get them out of the tomb for that." The advancement of the rebels started under the joint command of the Italian general from the land, and also by Capo, who was on the cruiser Canarias. There was radio emissions, but also flyers that were sent to the city, and he was threatening the people with a terrible revenge for what had happened during the 7 months that the previous 7 months, while the city had been dominated by the CNT. So his threats corresponded to the thousands of refugees that had reached the city after what the Phalangists, the indigenous regulars, and the Spanish Legion had committed in villages in Cádiz, Córdoba, Seville, and Granada. On the 12th of August and the 17th of September, Ronda and other cities were captured, and 35,000 elderly people and women and children went to Malaga. There were bombings from the Italian aviation and also warships in the hands of the rebels. And finally, the city of Malaga fell in their hands. Malaga was not being well defended. In spite of the victory, this easy victory, Capo had no mercy. During a whole week, the civilians were not allowed into the city, and thousands of Republicans were shooted on the basis of simple reports. Many said that if they had managed to flee from the hands of the Reds, that was because the Reds didn't have time to finish up with them. And Capo, one of his officers, said, "The Reds couldn't destroy us in 7 months because they didn't have sufficient time, but we will have more than enough with just 7 days. They were stupid." Thousands of people were detained, and when no prisons were full, there were concentration camps that were set up in Torremolinos and allowed in El Grande. Even before the arrival of Capo's soldiers, many people fled following the road on the coast from Malaga to Almeria. That was on the 6th of January, the first people who started fleeing. Chrysler commented on this. He was the correspondent of the News Chronicles. He referred to the aerial bombings and 2 p.m., the exodus started on the road towards Valencia. There were cars, lorries, people that were afraid, donkeys. This is a river of people, with all sorts of people, deserters, the civil governor, some officers from the major state. The resistance, the faith is being destroyed. No one can resist it. The magnetism of this river. No one knows where this river is going. As soon as it turns the first bend on the road. The road is still open, but under the fire of the warships and the planes. They're firing on this river of people. Nothing can stop it. It's flowing, and it is fed by the sources of fear. On the 8th of February, Paul referred to the masses of fugitives that were fleeing from Malaga. He referred to that on the radio, and he said that the aviation was there to help them run by bombing them. And also he put in several lorries in fire. The status of the city of Malaga explained why they were so willing to go through this ordeal. The road was covered by dead people and wounded people. People were advancing step by step. Dead mothers could be seen with babies in their arms. Dead children, lost children in the middle of the confusion, families looking for them. It is estimated that over 100,000 displaced people left the city, some on their own, carrying nothing, others carrying their bed sheets and kitchen tools. It is not certain, but it is estimated that at least 3,000 or 5,000 people died. On the radio, Capo said that these people were fleeing as we could see in his self-praising statements in the radio. He said that thousands of Republicans were being attacked, and that none of them would escape. The refugees walking on the road were fired from the Cervera and Baleares warships, and then also from the planes and the Italian aviation that were pursuing them. Lawrence Francewell, he was a correspondent from the Times in London, and he said that, well, his documents allows us to make sure the facts are known. In one of his articles, he referred to an Italian pilot who said that there were 17 Spanish, Italian, and German warships firing against the refugees. Much of what is known is thanks to the Canadian doctor Norma Bethune. He was in Spain for a short period of time, from the beginning of November 1936 until the end of May of 1937. And nevertheless, his contribution to the system of blood transfusion was highly important. He was a surgeon, a communist, very committed, and always working in favor of those who needed more help. According to Cisse, the architect who worked with Beton in Spain, he was the kind of person who could say, stand up and follow me, and then you would follow him. He was an authority. The Commission, the Canadian Commission of Help to the Spanish Democracy, had sent a medical unit to Madrid, and Dr. Beton, believing that it was needed to confront the fascism in Spain, accepted the invitation to run this medical unit. He arrived in Madrid on the 3rd of November with a Danish-Canadian journalist, Emil Sørensen, who acted as his interpreter. So after visiting the hospitals, the care or health facilities in Madrid, Beton realized that there were enough surgeons in the front line, but that, on the contrary, there was a lack of resources in the Republican Medical Service. So there was a lack of provisions for the blood transfusions, and this had an impact on the death index, on the death rate, because many wounded death because of the loss of blood. Maybe as a result of a shoot, or sometimes after a very difficult journey to the hospital with many problems, so they were not in a good condition to go through an operation. So the solution for this was to get the blood from the donors, and then they applied a conservation technique, and then it was taken to the frontline hospitals. Beton was given a service of this kind in Madrid with the support of the chief of the International Brigade's medical service and also from the Red Cross International, who gave them the opportunity to use a very important facility in Príncipe de Vergara, in a street of one of the most rich neighborhoods in Madrid. This was an area that was particularly protected by the fascists. So Beton had a good means to help, thanks to the Canadian committee. So he had resources to buy equipment, materials, health instruments and materials. And then he also bought a vehicle that he turned into an ambulance, a Ford. So he was appointed commander because he created the Blood Transfusion Institute. And the mission of this institute received a huge support by the population, the citizens of Madrid. So by the end of December 1936, the team of the Canadian Institute was already making the first blood transfusions in the area of the university. So it was a service 24/7 service. And maybe even sometimes Beton and his colleagues, even when they were sleeping, they could get ready in just some minutes and go and straight to transport, to take the necessary blood to the point where it was needed and then make the transfusion very fast. So in Madrid, doctors and wounded people were really thankful to this unit. And this unit even had at Villarejo de Salvarez a small health center
and they had trained some doctors with basic transfusion knowledge, skills. So he was appointed as the person in charge of the blood transfusions in that team. So all the medical staff was donating their own blood. It was really a terrible situation. At some point, Betun was given advice on the transfusion techniques, and they were collecting a great amount of blood. At the beginning, this service was providing blood for all the 56 hospitals in Madrid, but then some more units were installed throughout the 1,000 kilometers of the front line. So the idea was to extend this blood transfusion service over Madrid, beyond Madrid. So they wanted to have similar units in the whole Republican territory.
Betun y Sorensen se trasladaron al Instituto.
Betun and his colleague and Sorensen visited Barcelona to see Dr. Duran, and they made a proposal to him, and Duran agreed because they wanted to have the main center for the collection and distribution of blood in Barcelona. It was something reasonable because in Barcelona the facilities were quite superior to those in Madrid, and the methods were more advanced also, more sophisticated methods. So Betun acknowledged all these. He knew that Duran was a great professional hematologist, and he wasn't an hematologist, and he didn't even speak Spanish. So Betun accepted the conditions of Duran. They agreed on the terms, and they started to provide this service. Working with the Canadian teams, Betun got to put together all the necessary materials, and he bought a vehicle that he modified a little bit in order to create a vehicle adapted to the transport of blood. Cisse declared that he came back with a huge Renault van. It was very difficult to drive, it was very uncomfortable. So Cisse took it to the factory of General Motors in Barcelona, which was near the Sagrada Familia Church. And there they had all the workers and the trade unionists from the CNT that had collectivized this factory, and they all made a great effort to transform this vehicle into an ambulance. And this ambulance, Betun and Cisse, and also an English writer-to-be, Thomas Worsley, they spent, with this vehicle, they spent 3 whole days and nights making this trip back and forth between Malaga and Almería to help all the wounded persons in La Desbanda. And we do have descriptions of this van turned into an ambulance. They say it was a 2-ton closed artifact. So behind the driver's seat, there was all the equipment, and the dynamo and the fuel engine were close to this back door in the middle of the van, just on top of the structure. So this machinery was too heavy, too big to allow the installation of beds. So behind these beds, or these bunk beds, there were also equipment, baths, many other things. So at the beginning of 1937, Bethune had planned to take blood to the south of Spain, to the front line of the Republicans fighting against the advancement of Capo and his forces. So he established a unit, a blood transfusion point. When he arrived to Valencia, he went straight to the International Red Aid point, and he met some of the persons in charge. It would be a very important meeting with huge implications for the refugees that were already on the way to Almería. Carlos Contreras was the surname of one of the main promoters of the creation of the fifth unit of the 5th Brigade of the Republican Army. Even his companion had been implied. He was a friend of the Mexican painters Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. And she was a member of the Communist Party. She had spent some time in the Soviet Union with her lover Vidal, and both of them integrated the central unit of the International Red Aid, and they arrived in Spain by the end of 1935. Later on, in July 1936, Tina, who was a communist militant, had enrolled in the women brigade that was going to be in the workers' hospital just near Bethune's building. In fact, their office was just in the upper floor. So she worked with Bethune in the distribution in providing blood transfusion in the capital city and around the capital city. Now I'm going to talk when Bethune arrives to Valencia. At that point, he is informed that the rebel assault to Malaga had already started, so it was too risky to continue his journey to Malaga. It was needed to open a blood transfusion center in Valencia. But Bethune thought this was not a good idea, not at all. So he and Cisse decided to continue to Malaga because they considered this more urgent. Sometime after that, in Valencia, they learned that some of the Malaga authorities had left from the city. They ran away because there was no suppliers, there was no electricity, no water. So International Red Aid sent a team led by Matilde Landa to help the city of Malaga. And in the meantime, Bethune abandoned the fort and took the Renault to continue his journey to the south. When he arrives in Almería, the 10th of February, they found a city that had been completely bombed from the air and from the sea and from the land. So everyone told them it was too dangerous to continue. Nobody knows where they can go, nobody knows where are the troops. But they didn't listen to these warnings. They had a bite in a hotel and they just left to Malaga. So after some kilometers away from Almeria, they found this river of human beings coming from Malaga. They stopped and Cisse took some pictures that became really famous later on, and that show the head of this caravan. At the beginning, despite the terrible images, the terrible scenes, Betum was sure that his first mission was to take the blood he was transporting into the front line. This was the most important for him, because somewhere in this fallen city there are soldiers that are losing all their blood, and that need these transfusions. So probably they will find combats or direct action. Maybe they could help the rearwards. Maybe they could find some dying soldiers and just fulfill their mission, which was to take the blood to the front line. But at some point they were too tired. So they saw so many people, they found so many children, so many sick persons, that they stopped and just helped them, and mainly by taking them to some more secure places, more secure points.
This is the terrible procession of people. Small groups, then thicker and thicker groups, and then after that, the sun set, and this river of human beings continued flowing against us. This is the description by Cisse. Betún was swearing, and before the sun, it was completely dark. He stopped the lorry and asked me to take pictures of the refugees. We continued on until 9 or 10 p.m. and in a small village we were told fascists were some kilometers away and that we should not advance anymore. At that point, Betún had become so moved by this terrible human procession and the enormous quantity of children that we had started counted. And we had counted up to 4,000 or 5,000 children. And then he made a decision. He decided we should forget about the blood for transfusions and that we should try and save as many children as possible. So we turned the lorry around and we started loading the children inside, also 2 pregnant women, and then the doors were closed after about 30 children were on board. So I drove back. So I took them back all the way to Almeria. We left the children at the hospitals of the Red Aid. Betún gave the same description of that same scene with more details. The lorry stopped, finding a wall of refugees and animals. There were women shouting, many faces coming against the lorry. And as soon as we reached the top of the hill, this wall of refugees moved around the lorry. But it was the scene at the bottom that was terrible. We saw the plain below us, and instead of a road, we saw 20,000 human beings moving all at the same time, advancing very slowly with a lot of effort, coming from beyond the line of the horizon, reaching even the lower parts of the mountain range. For Bethune, these 200 kilometers of the road were 200 kilometers of misery. The most terrible destruction of a city our times had ever witnessed. They were the first. First, we found the strongest people, those who had animals and donkeys carrying their things. And as we advanced on, we saw people suffering more, children crying, suffering from pain, from hunger, from fatigue. There was a woman who was 60 years old who was not able to walk anymore, with wounded legs and feet. There was blood flowing down her legs, swollen legs, and her white shoes were all covered with blood, and many elderly were hopeless, sitting down on the side of the road just waiting for death to arrive. We have other descriptions of what people witnessed on the road. The refugees were advancing and filling up the road. The more we advanced, the worse the conditions were. Some were wearing basic shoes, but most just were walking on naked feet, most of them bleeding. We had covered over 120 kilometers, and we just saw people and people and more people. These people were suffering from their fatigue and terrible hunger, and we still saw more people arriving. Bethune said 10,000? No, 30,000. No, 40,000. It's just terrible. We just cannot imagine what they're suffering, to which degree. And then we saw the rocks on the beach fell of refugees trying to find a cover because we had heard the sound of the bombarders and the aviation. Scared children were looking up to the sky and covering their ears. They were trying to protect their heads. They were looking for shelter. Groups of people, mothers, absolutely exhausted, were protecting the bodies of their children with their own body. They were looking for holes in the land while they heard this roaring of the planes. And Bethune said, these people have already suffered other bombings. This is why they know how to behave. So they decided to fill in the ambulance with children. They opened the doors behind, and Worsley, in his description, says, instantly we became the heart of a crazy mass of people shouting. It was something real, with all these women shouting, holding their naked babies above their head, crying, feeling thankful or exhausted. So Bethune tried to select the children that were most in need, but the desperate women were coming, surrounding him, and then the ambulance was filled up with children, and he started driving towards Almeria. It was the first of several trips. When Worsley came back, he found out terrible scenes. So the stronger people had already gone by, and he found the weak and the wounded. Faces that were stained with dust and tears. The women's babies were nearly naked, and their legs showed so many eruptions and wounds. The lorry was completely full, but there were still people around it trying to get on. Many said, "It's not for me, comrade, it's not for me, just take my baby with you, take him, save him." Wesley did everything he could to try and fit in as many children as possible, but he felt desperate and useless. Bethune's diary and journal is even more moving than Worsley's version. In Almeria, in the Red Aid Hospital, Matilde Landa and Tina Molotti took the children in charge. Motherly was said, "Well, the war is terrible, but this massacre of the elderly, the women, and the children is the most terrible, horrible action." Bethune said, "Instead of doing blood transfusion, it's been wonderful because he's saved thousands of children." Matilde Landa was appointed by the Red Aid Committee to organize the distribution of drugs, food, clothes, and monetary support. She tried to find the way to get the families together through the local press, the radio stations, and different evacuation offices. And under her direction, the Red Aid Hospital hosted 20,000 refugees, distributed 500 tons of food, and distributed 2.5 million of pesetas. They also organized lorries to take the children to Valencia, and in order to do that, Matilde threatened desperate men with a gun who were trying to get on the lorries. When they had done everything they could for the refugees in Almeria, Cisse and Worsley went to Madrid while Bethune tried to buy more additional equipment for blood transfusion. Back to Valencia, he wrote in his journal his own description of the exodus from Malaga, published under the title "The Crime of the Road from Malaga to Almeria." He also gathered the foreign press in order to report the tragedy he had witnessed to the world. And he wrote, "We carried between 30 to 40 people each time. We were driving for 3 days and 3 nights. In the Red Aid Hospital, refugees received medical attention, food and clothes. In spite of Cisse and Worsley's efforts driving the lorries, well, thanks to this, we could save many lives. They were driving constantly, one or the other, eating just some bread from time to time and sleeping when they couldn't continue driving. This peasants' procession has been bombed and fired, and on the 12th of January, the small port of Almeria was full with refugees, with a population that had doubled. And after the arrival of these thousands of people to this that they thought was a safe refugee, the Italian and German fascist soldiers bombed the population again. The alarm sounded 30 seconds before the first bomb exploded. The enemy planes did not try to target the warships that were in the port. They fired 10 bombs in the main street of the city, where refugees were sleeping. When the planes left, I found 3 corpses of children that had been waiting for 3 hours in a queue, waiting for a glass of milk and a piece of bread, which were the only foodstuffs available. The street was like a slaughterhouse, with the dead and the agonizing injured. In the dark, the shouts of the agonizing mothers, the cries of the children, and the shouts of men all came together. My body felt heavy with the weight of the dead, and in my brain, hate emerged. Hatred emerged. Bethune didn't say that himself and Worsley were walking. And that was another exhausted body in this column of people who were desperately tired and hungry. Bethune and Cisse took a lorry full of children to a center, a small hospital in the outskirts of Almeria. The children were extremely tired and no one came up to feed them, but Bethune then exploded with anger. He went into the kitchen, gave orders to the staff, and put all the milk available into big casseroles with Cisse, and he took all the bread he could. He was shouting at the staff, and Bethune managed to feed the children. Cisse and himself found a way to put them down for the night, and then they came back to the road to save more children. Kate Mangan, the young British journalist, traveled with the Times correspondent and other journalists to inform about the situation of the refugees. She was working with Constancia de la Mora in Valencia, in the press office of the Republican government there. She also described this tragedy as a complement to what we've heard. Katie and her colleagues had several contacts with the diplomats from the UK, and this also informs of the foreign policy of London. They contacted the British consul, and there were questions about whether there were lorries taking supplies to Malaga, now in the hands of Franco, and the answer was yes. And then they asked if any of those lorries would bring food to Almeria, and the answer was no. This was from the consulate. The arrival of refugees to Almeria created a lot of horror and confusion. I've already referred to the bombing of the center of the city that was described by Beton. And, well, that. And the bombing of the refugees on the road and also in the streets of Almeria. This was a symbol of what the rebels intended to do.
La caída de Málaga y el éxodo posterior, el gobierno.
The government of the Republic created a commission in order to write down a report with the Minister of Justice, of Public Works and Agriculture. The three ministers went to Almeria, where they interviewed many people, and they presented the report on the 11th of February. So this was given to the international press by García Oliver, and they showed a very tragic version of what had happened.
La evacuación de Málaga comenzó.
The evacuation of Malaga started when the population learned about the challenges of the front lines, because nobody attended such a dramatic cataclysm in Europe. So the streets of Malaga were crowded with thousands of people crying and trying to flight when they heard that fascists were coming, were arriving. Everyone seemed to be crazy. Several thousands of refugees escaped from the city through the road to Almeria, where they expected to find peace and to be safe from the fascists. These hopes were soon to become a bloody reality, and the whole journey turned into a nightmare of bombings from the German and Italian planes and cruise ships. And this road was soon full of corpses, and of course there were a series of heroic individual acts. Some people who couldn't keep on walking, they even killed their children to prevent them to fall into the hands of fascists. The children who had lost their parents were running, crying, screaming, and many of them were trampled by the crowd. The fascists would shoot them directly, and some of them get to arrive to Motril, where they had a little moment, a little pause, but very soon again they started hearing this shout of fascists are coming again. So people kept trying to escape as fast as possible. So this terror led a whole trace of blood, and this human river advanced slowly. Meanwhile, husbands and wife got apart. They lost each other because of this escape from fascism. Once they got to Almeria, Almeria was a very poor city that wasn't ready to host so many people, and this led to a terrible situation. Wherever you looked at every street, you could find people lying on the floor. So this population, who was a working class population, had been turned into a homeless bunch of people because of the fascism. None of them regrets having left the city of Malaga, because they were all ready to abandon everything, even their families, even the wives, or even the children, before or to avoid falling into the hands of the fascists. So people had left Malaga, many people already. Malaga was a city where there was no food. Almeria was a city where there was not much food. So the fact that so many people arrived in this city was perceived as something really bad for the city, because they were so needy. There was not even enough medical attention, not even enough medical care. Of course, there was the international Red Aid, but nothing was enough. They had to use churches and schools to host all these people. The population from Almeria received these people with a mix of hostility and empathy. Those who had just arrived were starving, so there was a series of robberies, of course. But let's listen to some of Beton's words. In his personal journal, Beton describes very precisely the aerial bombing of the city of Almeria. And he highlights the fact that the bombings were not directed to the port, for instance, which was a strategic target, but instead of that, they were directed to the civil population. And I quote, "At some point I get to the city center, where the streets were not dark anymore. I see walls of fire, flames, and everything was lightened by the fire of the bombings. All you could see were crowds of people who tried to escape from the bombs, or falling under the walls that had been destroyed. They disappeared in the smoke, shouting, screaming at the same time as they disappeared. So I tried to make my way through the crowd, saying, I'm a doctor, and I keep listening to explosions. I keep listening to the donkeys crying, screaming. And then at some point the bombing stops, and I can only listen to the planes that leave. I see the buildings on fire that give some light, and then let me see all these faces, terrified, frightened faces. And then silence. No, not at all. After the bombing, I was able to listen to the voices of those dead or dying. I start to hear also those who were wounded trying to help each other. using their clothes or whatever they had. I also find a small girl who was under a building that had fallen, under the beams of a building that had fallen. I take her and I put her lying on a small bed, thinking that it was better that she died, because if she was going to live, the reality was going to be too terrible for her. Finally, I get to a silent circle of men and women that were surrounding the impact of a bomb. Inside this circle, there was a mass of corpses, and my own body felt as heavy as the one of the dead people, completely empty, and my brain was burning with an enormous flame of hate. Thank you very much. Of hatred.